Hey, everybody. Welcome to Seen and Heard. This is the podcast where two entertainment assistants go through the Sight and Sound Top 100 Greatest Films of All Time list. I'm Greg.
I'm Jackie.
And we're here this week to discuss the 9.5-hour Claude Lanzmann documentary, Shoah, from 1985.
Yes, we are.
It did take us a little bit of time to work up to this one. Initially, we were going to do this episode in two segments for the first era and the second era.
Yeah.
But we decided it would be best to contain all of our thoughts to a single episode. So that's what this is.
Yeah. And it was honestly just like we didn't know what we were getting into. I mean, like, yeah, we had an idea, but when we started watching it, it became very clear that like there really isn't like a big dividing factor between the first era and the second era. And it does make the most sense to just treat it as one movie. So that's what happened.
Yeah, so I know when this showed theatrically, people watched it in like one day.
Which is wild.
I think with just an intermission in between the first era and the second era. But each era is still like nearly 5 hours long.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, each era, yeah.
Yeah. So I can't
imagine.
Yeah. So we did get to split this up over like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, it was like a span of like a week.
Right.
So this episode is going to be a little bit different than normal. We're not going to do a lot of our normal segments. I think we're just going to get straight into the film. Mm-hmm. What number is this on the list?
This is number 27 on 2022 and number 29 on 2012.
Oh, okay, so it got bumped up like by 2 slots for the new list.
2 slots, yeah. Which I think is understandable.
I think so too. Well, should we just get into the film?
Let's get into the film.
All right, Jackie. Well, why don't you tell us the specs?
I have quite a lot.
I'm ready.
It's a long movie. Shoah was released in 1985. It was directed by Claude Lanzmann. Cinematography by Dominique Chapuis, Jimmy Glasberg, Phil Grease, and William Lubchansky. There's no score, but I feel like it's important to mention the editor, Ziva Postek, who dedicated nearly 6 years of her life to editing the film. Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust, is a 9.5-hour documentary composed of interviews with survivors, witnesses, and perpetrators of the eponymous atrocity. The film is unique in that it includes no archival footage whatsoever. Rather, the interviews are interwoven with contemporary footage of the locations of the death camps and towns that are the subjects of the testimonies. The primary subjects of the film include the Helmino, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camps, detailing the mechanics of the murders by mobile gas vans and gas chambers. The principal survivors, Lanzmann's interviewees, were put into work units upon arrival at the camps, bearing witness to the horrors, but ultimately surviving. They are as follows. Simon Srebnik, who at 13 was notorious in Helmino for his beautiful voice, and was forced by SS officers to sing while he worked. Mordechai Polchebnik, also from Helmino. Abraham Bomba, a barber who was forced to cut the hair of female victims at Treblinka. And Richard Glaser, also from Treblinka. Philip Mueller, who was assigned to work at the crematorium at Auschwitz, and Rudolf Verba, also from Auschwitz, who was assigned a registrar role but eventually escaped. In addition to these survivors, Lanzmann interviewed several Polish eyewitnesses who still reside in the towns and villages where the killings took place. These include families living in houses that once belonged to Jews, those who remember Simon singing, and a train conductor, Henryk Grakowski, who had to be inebriated in order to continue operating the trains that took thousands of Jews to their deaths. He is the man who appears on the train on the film's poster. Lanzmann also secretly recorded interviews with former SS officers who didn't know he was a filmmaker, and they described the roles they played at the camps. He also explores the daily life inside the Warsaw Ghetto, as well as the eventual uprising. Lanzmann interviews Jan Karski, a member of the Polish underground who entered the ghetto so he can bear witness and share what he saw with the Allied governments in his appeals for help. Raoul Hilberg, the preeminent Holocaust historian, is featured throughout the film, and he sheds light on the detailed journal of the Jewish leader of the Warsaw Ghetto, Adam Chernikov, who eventually committed suicide when he learned what resettlement actually meant. So, Lanzmann was originally commissioned by Israeli officials to make a normal-length feature film documentary about the Holocaust. They eventually backed out, and he dealt with several financial issues while making the film. The film took a total of 11 years to complete. The first 6 years were dedicated to shooting, including 4 years of interviews before even going to Poland. It comes out to 350 hours of interviews taking place in 14 countries. One of the SS officers he recorded in secret found out about the hidden camera, and Lanzmann was beaten in the street. He was hospitalized and was charged with unauthorized use of the German airwaves by West Germany. The film was released to widespread acclaim everywhere except Poland. The Polish opinion was that the film was unfair to the many stories of Poles risking their lives for their Jewish neighbors, and that it implied that the Polish peasantry was so provincial as to allow the exterminations to happen in their backyards. The detractors also claim that Lanzmann completely ignores the massacres of non-Jewish Poles at the hands of the Nazis. For a 4-night PBS broadcast in 1987, the film was divided into 2 sections, the first era and the second era, with each era being divided into 2 parts. The Polish American Congress expressed their discontent when it played on TV in America. It won the BAFTA for Best Documentary, New York Film Critics Circle for Best Nonfiction Film. And there are 4 feature-length documentaries Lanzmann made using the unused material for Shoah, the most recent one being Shoah 4 Sisters, which outlines the survival stories of 4 women who escaped concentration camps. It's 4.5 hours long, and it was released in U.S. cinemas in November of 2018. That's what I got for specs.
Yeah, I think he just died in like 2018, 2019, something like that.
I think 2018. I wonder if it came out before or after he passed.
He was in his 90s, I think.
Little background on Claude Lanzmann. His parents immigrated to France from Eastern Europe. Strangely, I couldn't find where in Eastern Europe, but he was born in France to Jewish parents. During the war, he was a member of the resistance while also trying to stay hidden from the Nazis. And after the war, he was prosecuted for his anti-Algerian war sentiments. He signed some petition that got him in trouble. He taught philosophy in Berlin. He snuck over to East Germany to do some journalism. He liked breaking the law, and it's clear in Shoah, obviously, but that's kind of what he was about. He became an editor for Le Temps Moderne, which is the journal founded by Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He and Beauvoir were a couple. They lived together for 7 years. Do you know Simone de Beauvoir? She's like the ultimate, she wrote like the ultimate feminist manifesto. She's like a feminist thinker, novelist, writer.
Oh, okay.
She's really cool. She was. She was really outspoken about Shoah. Like she came out and said like this is a masterpiece, even though they were already broken up. Yeah, so he was in this like group of existentials in France. And what he said about why he didn't use archival footage, he said like it's always the same archive. It's interpreted differently depending on the guy who was using them. I prefer to create things myself if I can. And yeah, he makes a good point. He said there isn't a single photo. There are no archives of what goes on inside a gas chamber, which is true, obviously. Yeah.
Wow. I think to start Roger Ebert said something really interesting about this movie.
Yes.
In that it's not a documentary.
I have that down.
It's an act of witness.
Yeah.
And I do think that is like pretty apt in
definitely
describing his approach to this and what the film ultimately is. It's a historical document.
Definitely. And even the guy from the Polish underground, like when he was hesitant, he kept acknowledging him. He's like, I know what you're doing. I know this is a film. I know it's history. Like he kept saying that. And I thought that was really interesting. It's just like the people who are on board of like, yeah, making a documentary, but it's really, it's going to be like history essentially.
Yeah, 'cause a lot of these people, this is something that they would rather forget. And I think you get the impression from a lot of these people, or they flat out say that this is not something that they talk about. That's not something that like you have that professor at the end, like he's never told his students. That's
who I'm talking about. The Polish underground.
Exactly.
Guy,
yeah. So it's like, it's.
And what's interesting about him, I don't want to get too deep into it, but he just went into the ghetto. Like, he didn't even go to the camps. He
Yeah.
just went to the ghetto and then left. Like, he was able to leave, and he was that distraught.
Yeah.
More than some of the survivors of the actual camps that we saw. So I was very taken by that.
Yeah. Same.
Initial thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, this is one that you hear about. This is, rightfully known as one of the great, I'll say, documentaries. Although I feel like still that word is like not apt enough to describe what this really is, which is a living document to this horrible time, this horrible, like the lowest point in recent human history. It's insane too to just think that I was born like 40 years later. Like this is so not far in the rearview mirror that like that's the point. That's the part of this movie that like whenever I think about the Holocaust, that you have to remind yourself that this is still so recent. Like there are still people living now who lived through this.
Right.
But I do think that this film was made at like the perfect time in history, because people have, I think he started interviewing people like in 1974, I believe, because it took like 6 years to shoot and 5 years to edit. And I think at that point, you're just 30 years removed from the events of the film, 35 years. So people had enough time to kind of reflect on it. Like it wasn't so fresh that had just happened, but they're all still like alive and well and with it. You know what I mean? In terms of, the survivors. But yeah, this was interesting. This was simultaneously a very tough watch, but also a really enthralling one in the way that like, I think Lanzmann's filmmaking is really incredible here in that he's not pushing himself as a filmmaker. Like every choice he makes here is in service of the film he's making, and it's not flashy. It's not, I don't think there's a single music cue in here, in terms of, it's not manipulative. Mm-mm. Like it's just a very frank, it's faces and it's the locations where these happened. And again, it's not, like you said, it's not archival. It's like what it looks like now. So it's like the death camps, but they're overgrown and everything. I mean, what's there to say? It's incredible. I haven't seen anything like it before. We did watch this over the course of like a week. And so I think that was helpful. I found myself at times like really overwhelmed by the material, even though like it was totally, I don't want to say engaging because that's not what it's supposed to be, but
I think it is supposed to be engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree. I just feel like I feel
it's
weird.
Not supposed to be entertaining.
No,
but
exactly.
It's supposed to be engaging.
But of course, you're gripped throughout the entire thing.
Yeah.
But I found myself, even though it's broken up into these 4 segments, I'd have to usually break each of those segments up until like 2 or 3 segments. Like I would get up and do something else for a while and then come back because it did get to be so overwhelming.
It did.
But yeah, I think it's a masterpiece. I mean,
agreed.
There's nothing I can really say. I'm just really glad that someone took the time to do this properly and did it when they did, because again, you couldn't make this film now because people are too old at this point. The survivors are really old, or most of them have passed away at this point. So yeah, I mean, I think obviously everybody should see this once in their lives. And it's insane that we live in a world where we still see anti-Semitism, and we still see people who are Holocaust dismissers, who believe it didn't happen or that it was blown out of proportion. That stuff just boggles my mind. But again, there are people who think the earth is flat too. So yeah, this is,
true.
I think, one of the most essential pieces of cinema I've ever seen. So
also, I just said it's true. I didn't mean that the earth is flat, just that there are
the people.
survivors.
Yeah.
Just want to clarify. I agree. This is one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. I think it's the first part of the first era. It's like after I finished that, first of all, I didn't think I was going to watch it all in one sitting, that first part. But I did, because like I kind of couldn't look away. After that, I was like physically affected. Like I was like so just like my face was puffy. I was tired. I was like, I don't want to do anything, see anyone, talk to anyone. The first part of that first era. It got a little easier as time went by, but really I found myself for an entire week just being like, why am I so mad and why do I have a headache? And then I realized like it's the first time I think a movie like had a physical effect on me. I agree with everything you said. I don't watch that many docs. I really don't. But easily, and this is just like initial, like first 20 minutes. I knew like from the first 20 minutes, I was like, this is the most beautiful. I mean, I use the word beautiful in like just like the amount that I was moved. I literally texted him because I told my boyfriend about this and he texted me, he's like, how is it? And I was 20 minutes in, I was like, this is the most beautiful doc I've ever seen. Like immediately. And it was just like 20 minutes. So that's how I feel about it. It's not a doc. I think Ebert is so right. It actually isn't really a doc. But he is using the tools of cinema. I mean, he really is. It is sight and sound to convey this unspeakable evil without one malicious visual. And I think that is just, I think it's a miracle. I think it's incredible. It really is like, and I say that it is this, like, it is using sight and sound, but it's also a book because I was hearing the stories and I was picturing in my head while still seeing what I'm seeing on the screen. There's something else going on in my mind, an entire story being played out.
Right.
It's just a completely unique experience, I think. And just, I love how he never clarifies because throughout you hear like differing things almost. Like it'll be like, some Polish people saying like, oh, like, I don't think the Jews knew. And then you would have one survivor saying, we immediately knew. And then you had another survivor saying like, no, we didn't know. Like, what is the word Auschwitz? I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And I just love that he just lays everything on the table. Like there's no voiceover. I mean, there's no like him coming in
there's
and
no
being
voiceover.
Like, there's no clarifying. There's nothing. I also think there's
movie, some text though. A couple places there's some text that fills in some gaps, but it's rare.
Yeah. I think that this technique of just like leading us through the physical places, a place that's nothing now, that's beautiful now, that's just a forest. It almost looked like a Tarkovsky movie at points.
Yeah.
But so haunted. Like what I don't know, like just how did he, I don't know. Well, it's kind of hard to put into words because I think it is like miraculous. Like I think it's incredible. And yeah, what a good use of zoom. I think like, has zoom ever been used better in a movie? I think that the zooms in this are incredible.
Yeah.
Those are my initial thoughts.
I'll say too, just going off, I completely agree with everything you said. I think the sites of the death camps are like in theory beautiful because they're all like sort of in the woods and you have all these trees which the Nazis planted to cover up bodies.
Right. And then you hear that while you're watching it and you're like,
but it's like, I think even without knowing what happened, there's something about each of those sites that while it is green and stuff and lush, it looks, there's something really, really hideous about it. Like that you can see already visually.
Yeah.
That there's something wrong.
Of course. Yeah. Of course.
And I do like the way that he captures each of the camps sort of like in different seasons. You get a lot of them at winter with snow and stuff like that. I was just going to add to mine too. One of the things I love so much about this is we have so many like bird's eye view documentaries and like that's history, right? Like go take a history class, go read a book. If you want a bird's eye view of how this happened and sort of what happened. And I love that his film is this, he's always asking people about details. Like, tell me about this. How did this look? How did this sound? How did this smell?
Yeah.
And that's truly the strength of this film is like, it is such a harrowing personal account of like the inner workings of this stuff, right? Because there's a lot of stuff I didn't know that I learned in this film, but you know the gist going into it. But then you hear about, you know, people outside of the gas chambers hearing the motors running or like the funnel that they used or like all of that stuff, all of that really, really terrifying firsthand, the accounts are just, I mean, it's what makes the film because it makes it personal.
Yeah.
It makes it personal. It's not just someone narrating being like, you know,
Yeah.
30,000, you know, it's literally showing you. And I think the way in which he shows these sites now, and you hear the person talking about it and it's overlaid over the image. And I think the balance between that is really nice. Like he knows when to focus on the person's face, and he will just sit on the person's face for like 5 minutes sometimes, you know?
It's very artfully crafted. Like that's why like I agree it's not really a doc, but I do think it's a piece of art.
It's like, a piece of cinema. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. But it doesn't get in its own way. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I think too, I'll just mention this because for the film club, when we did Shoah, the same week we did a Pasolini film for the film club, is a film called Tia Rima. And that I watched that in between episodes of Shoah. And it's such an affected like art film that like it really, like I don't think I would have liked it anyway, but like I hated it watching it in the middle of Shoah, because Shoah is just such a unpretentious like generous piece of filmmaking of like, this is a historical document, and like Claude Lanzmann's not in the way of the film, and to see a film where a director was completely in the way of the film.
Yeah.
Again, not to compare a documentary to a piece of narrative fiction, but yeah, I just like anything I watched in the middle of Shoah,
I was going to bring this up.
Was just like,
I agree.
Yeah, much worse.
It really, really affected me watching. I didn't want to watch anything in between, but then I also didn't even really want to watch Shoah because I knew that I would just be a mess after throughout, really. So it was this really weird, it's been a weird 2 weeks. You're so right. I didn't like watching things in between. And I actually like, just to lighten things up a little bit, like when I finished it, I was like, I need to watch Mean Girls. That was it. Like
Mean Girls?
I had to. I was like, I need to watch something that's just gonna like, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I did. But let's talk about, so the way I've kind of structured this episode, it was very hard to structure this episode because usually like I have like main points and then I have examples, right? I kind of structure it like an essay, but like with this, I was kind of dividing it between first, like the parts, the 2.5 hour bursts in which I watched each one. So it does kind of go in more like a chronological order, but I also bring in things from all over the place, if that makes sense.
I want to say too, sorry, because I meant to say earlier, when you said it's beautiful, I do agree with you because of all the people that have survived, and I think especially opening with that guy, Simon, I forget who's on the river on the boat and singing.
Oh my God.
It's beautiful.
Immediately I was sobbing. Like I was just, it wasn't even like, oh yeah, the Simon stuff is really, really,
you know, it's sad, you know, it's a small number of people who came out of this, but the people who did that, you know, you're seeing them now, a lot of them in middle age, like their 50s and 60s. And to see the guy, I think his name is Bamba, the barber. Yeah. To see him like on a boat with like a Hawaiian shirt just made me happy.
That made me happy too. That was before we see him at work.
Yeah.
We'll get to
that.
So yeah, you're right. Like opening, already had chills, already crying. But let's talk about like the spatial orientation, like kind of what we were saying. And like immediately when it started, I immediately caught like the quiet. Yes, he's singing, but then it's quiet. And someone even says something about these Polish forests. There's a charm of our forests, the silence, the beauty. Like they actually say that. And then someone comes in, of course, and says like, oh, but of course that was disrupted. So like immediately I was like, okay, quiet, forest, horror. Like it was just like, I don't know. But no, I mean, God, I don't, it's really hard to talk about this.
It is.
We get into like Mordechai, right? And he's the one who said how he had to open up the graves, and he's asking him about when it was snowy, and then he's taking us to the actual spot covered in snow, and we're hearing Mordechai talk about it. And it was just, I don't know. I don't know.
I think too, the way in which they talk about it in a very frank, sort of matter of fact way.
Yeah.
But you get all the details about like everything they saw.
Yeah.
And
but even though he's bringing it to today, like we're seeing it today, but we're hearing that, and it's covered in snow, and we're hearing Mordechai talk about the snow, and I don't know.
I wonder if it's some mixture of like catharsis, but also like, you know, how difficult it would be for them to return to those sites all those years later. Like
Definitely.
I wonder if it's more cathartic or if it's just like really terrible.
Simon was the only one I think that was like actually at the town, because everyone else he was interviewing them like in Israel, or one guy was in Switzerland.
One guy was in New York.
One guy was in New York, Rudolph, who was I really liked Rudolph.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple people in the U.S. and then the historian was in like Vermont.
He's in Vermont. Yeah. But he's taking you to all these places of like varying significance. And you know, everywhere you go has evil. Like, and that feeling is just like, even the simplest place, like, you know that there's like this underlying horror.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to adjust, like, to watching this movie. I know we're talking a lot about the experience of watching this movie rather than the movie itself, I feel like. But that's natural, I think, with something like this.
I agree with you. And I think there's a way... It's almost hard to believe at some of those locations or some of those towns that this happened like right there.
And they remember them.
And in the 20th century. Can you believe this happened in the 20th century? This wasn't the Middle Ages.
No.
Like Cary Grant was a movie star. Jim, you know, they were on the screen and this was happening.
Yeah.
Like, this is not that long ago.
I know. And you know what? After watching this, I started to think about all the movies I love that take place in the era. And I got like kind of sick to my stomach. Like, I was like, I don't know. I got really, I did a double take. I'm like, wait, do I actually love Inglourious Bastards now, or do I not? Like, I don't know. Did you have like a similar thing?
Like other war films or other
films about Nazis? Like fiction films.
Interesting. Like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Nazis are kind of a cartoon villain.
Yeah.
Sure. I think
even like To Be or Not to Be, a movie I deeply, deeply love. I was like, am I going to be able to watch this again? I think it's going to take some time.
Or like The Producers, the Mel Brooks movie. I don't know. I think, you know, in the years after the war, like there was this way of like, that was how they were taking the air out of it.
I know.
Diminishing it was through humor,
which I totally understand.
You even have The Great Dictator by Chaplin,
right
during the war.
Yeah.
Also shout out to our friend Aaron, who has a great podcast called Behind the Slate, who did a whole series on Chaplin. But yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, that's why there's so many comedies based around it, and I think that's why Spielberg had them as these cartoonish villains in Indiana Jones. I think. Also, if we're looking at Spielberg, because I think we should talk about him briefly, because he has made what many people consider to be the definitive narrative film on the Holocaust, which is Schindler's List. I was recently rewatching a couple scenes from Schindler's List, and there's a scene, tell me if you remember this, where they're led into what you think is a gas chamber.
And then it's actually
the lights
a shower,
go out, and it's actually a shower. And there were no instances in Shoah of them talking about like, oh, then we actually just like the water turned on.
I don't know. Yeah.
And it kind of felt a little false.
Yeah. I don't know if that actually happened.
Yeah. I mean, again, neither of us are experts.
No,
but
of course.
It just seemed like a little, like everything I've heard in Shoah is that
they had no idea. And we'll get to that. That's like a main theme of one of the parts, is just the utter ignorance of, and the heartbreaking way that they tricked them. So like, would those people going in the gas chamber, because they're scared in Schindler's List, right?
Yeah.
They know it's a gas chamber.
The lights go off, just like they describe in this.
The impression I get from Shoah, especially in that one part in the second era, was that, well, but then in Schindler's List, they're in the concentration camp. I guess this is different because these are extermination camps. And there is a difference between like the pure like extreme extermination camps and the concentration camps. Mm-hmm. I don't know is my short answer of the shower, but that's interesting.
Yeah. It almost felt like it was trying to take the easy way out of like, oh, we're going to show you the dangers of what the gas chamber was like. But then, no, just kidding. It's the shower. And I'm not trying to like disparage Schindler's List, because it's a great movie.
I've never heard.
Yeah, it felt a little like false. It felt like a false note.
Yeah. I don't know. That's interesting.
There is a film too, just while sorry, I know I keep going off on tangents here. There's a film that came out a few years ago that I haven't seen. It's now at the top of my list. It's called Son of Saul. Did you see it?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
So it's about, I don't know if he's a Polish Jew, but it's literally about, he's put to work in one of the camps, and his job is like stacking the bodies or like taking the bodies out.
Like some of our survivors, like Philip.
Exactly. So there's a film all about that from just a couple of years ago.
Interesting.
And I'm pretty sure too, I haven't seen the film yet, but it's shot in like Academy ratio to make it feel kind of tight. And I think most of the film just focuses on his face. So instead of seeing the horrors, you're just seeing his reaction to things.
That's interesting.
So
That's
anyway,
really
sorry, I totally derailed you.
No, it's okay. Of course, I started thinking of The Pianist. And I, especially with the Warsaw Ghetto stuff, like I did a similar thing that you did with Schindler's List. I was trying to think like, okay, but how is it in The Pianist? And how does it compare to what we're actually hearing now? I think it's a natural reaction from watching this movie.
Yeah.
But going back to kind of just like the spatial, what we were talking about is like one of the techniques that I thought was so moving was hearing stories that were kind of dragged out. And it was like handheld camera taking you through, and then you finally land on the place that you're hearing about.
Monument.
So it's like the monument for the leader of the ghetto. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, no, just like you'll see like...
Well, that was one of them. They were talking about him, like Chernikov, and they're talking about his journal, and you're going through a graveyard, and like you don't really know what you're going to land on, but of course you land on his grave.
Right.
The most moving, the one that like broke me was Philip. Who worked in the crematorium.
Oh God.
That was a little like,
yeah.
But you know what I mean, right? It's like he was taking us through these spaces. We didn't know where we were going, and we land exactly in the crematorium when Philip is talking about that. But that's filmmaking. Like that was like pure filmmaking.
I think too, Philip, his big segment is like the first half of the second era, right? I believe.
He's pretty.
But he's in the second part of part one a little bit, but his accounts are in a lot of ways the most terrifying because he literally like you said, he worked in the crematoriums, and the stuff that he saw was some of the most horrific stuff.
And I love the way he talks. Yeah. He's such a good speaker, and I love his voice was so soft and soothing, and it was just like when he does finally break, like that was like I knew we were done with Philip. I was like, okay, like this man he's done now.
Yeah.
And that was just a whole other. It's the fact of being with them for 9 hours. But yeah, I know we're kind of hopping all over the place, but I think that's kind of the way to do it. Well,
the film kind of does too.
It does, but like going back to Simon a little bit, or going back, this is in the first era, and this is what I mean about like what we're seeing, what we're hearing, the dance hall.
Oh, the dance hall.
Remember the dance
with
hall?
The Germans?
Yeah.
Yeah, the older couple that's dancing.
And you can only assume that's the dance hall that whoever was telling us about, like they put us in a dance hall, and you see people in modern day dancing.
Yeah.
Another incredible one was when they were describing when Jan, or I think it was the resistance fighters, the surviving resistance fighters were talking about how they re-entered Warsaw and from the ghetto, and they were like, wow, it's just normal life is continuing. And then he's just on, what we're seeing is just a regular modern 80s crosswalk in Warsaw. Yeah. Like that's, I don't know.
No, it's
unlike anything I've ever seen. Like truly, truly.
Agreed.
And then again with the ordinary, like today life, like the horse in Corfu, like that was incredible.
Right.
That horse ride.
Yeah. I really loved the way that he tackles so you mentioned the dance hall. I feel like shortly after that is when he stalks the ex-Nazi that works in like the beer garden or something.
Yes.
And that's like, I mean, it's so surreal because as soon as we came of age and were aware of this chapter of history, again, like it's so far in the past at that point, or not, again, I was just saying it's not that far, but it was far enough in the past to not have daily reminders of it. But the fact that in the 70s, you just like everywhere. All these ex-Nazis like that just were in the SS and, it's just wild.
Yeah. And that's another technique of his was like, you're going to a place, you don't know why it's significant, but then it becomes very clear. Yeah. Like you're like, why are we in this restaurant? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
And then he even calls him by his name, Mr. Something. And then you hear in another testimonial, that was that driver. Like, you don't even know when he says it. You have an inkling that it's a former Nazi just because of the way he's like,
skittish.
He doesn't want to talk and he doesn't want to look at the pictures. But then you hear in another testimony that bartender was a driver.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Another good one of just like everyday life is the church service. So in the Helmino, like one of the places that they were gathering everyone was this church. And then you just see normal church service going on. You're with the organist, you're with the choir, you're with the priest who's like not even singing. Like those shots.
Yeah.
And then of course Simon outside the church and everyone around him. And then it zooms on his face.
Well, some of those villages too, very little has changed in that time,
know.
right? From when it happened to then.
That whole part, I think that was the first era. Second part was about kind of like the remaining anti-Semitism a little bit. But the people outside the church were like, yes, we remember Simon. Like, we're so glad he's here. And they seemed sympathetic. But there was the other guy with black teeth who was saying they're not pretty. And I'm like, dude, you have black teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, except the women. Like, I miss the women. Yeah. And I was like, God damn it.
Yeah, I know.
But let's talk about like... Oh, there's just like, there's so much. Like, just going back to like how I was talking about the like the pastoral scenes, kind of those bunnies at Auschwitz,
mm-hmm.
the little boy with a bicycle, like passing by the sign for Treblinka. And it's like, I don't know.
I know. One thing I didn't know before this, I was going to say doc, but I'll just say this film, was how close some of these people, their daily lives were affected by the camps. Like when they talked to the people, in Poland who literally their farms were right up against the back of the camps, and they would be like, I was tilling my farms and I would hear screams, and then just talking about the psychology of like how terrifying it is at first, but then you just get used to it.
Oh.
Like, can you imagine getting used to just hearing people scream out in pain and terror?
And I think that's why the train conductor has become kind of like the symbol for the movie.
Right.
First of all, trains are like huge in the movie, obviously. Yeah. But when he's talking about like, I had to drink vodka, and he was like, at first, like, I couldn't stand it, but he was one of the people who was like eventually like, well, I mean, he was drinking to stand it. But you get varying things. Like, there were some people who were like, I never got used to it. There were some people who were like, yes, I was basically dead. Like, you have to be dead.
Yeah.
You got all these different feelings and opinions. One guy was like, I didn't think I could get used to it, but then I did. But now I don't know. I don't know how I could ever have reached that point.
Right.
It was just incredible.
Because you're doing what you can do to survive. Your brain is helping you cope.
There was someone at the end, I don't remember, who was like, it's a fact that I think it was like the former official, the guy who was working in the ghetto, but he was like a German, not the Polish underground guy. I think he was saying something where it's like, it's like a biological fact that we tend not to remember the really tragic stuff. And you're right, like, and he's right to an extent, like, people repress trauma all the time, but then we just spent 8 hours hearing people, 9.5 hours, hearing people remember the smallest details. So I just love how, like, I just love all the different facts you hear and all the different opinions and all the different feelings. Mm-hmm. And they're each kind of, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I wonder too why the last Nazi agreed to be on camera, because all the other ones, it's a hidden camera.
He seemed like he was very much.
He's convinced that he had very little to do with.
Yeah.
Which all of them say. That's why they even agreed to be interviewed.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, I didn't know the extent to which this was happening, or like, I was a small
One
cog.
says like we all cried the first day.
Yeah. It's wild.
It's
Those
wild.
SS interviews were wild.
The van, when you realize what's happening, when you see the
closed circuit
van
TV,
and you're like, what is this? And then we go inside the van and we're like, oh.
Yeah.
That's like those wild, inventive moments of his that are like, there's one of my favorites is, well, I feel weird saying the word favorite, but one of the ones that I found very, very incredible was when he was talking about, He was reading the letter about the vans and how the vans need to be...
The lamps?
Yes, and how they need to be improved, and this is what we want. And it was a letter to the company. I wrote it down here. Basically, when he zooms in on the truck, I think it's like Soar, but he's just driving down the highway and he's reading the letter to the truck company. And then he's just driving and he zooms in and it's the same logo, the same brand.
Yeah.
That was incredible.
Yeah.
That was, yeah.
Yeah, all this stuff is still around. Well, it was then. Yeah, absolutely.
That one was wild. And then the one where it might even be the same thing. It's like he's just reading about like the mechanics. He's reading like a letter about literally like the mechanics of the murders. And he's just driving past factories.
Yes.
That was incredible.
One thing this film really shed light on me, I know we briefly touched on it, was the psychology that the Germans used to get the Jews to enter the camps. Like they would call the undressing rooms outside of the gas chambers like information centers or something with like benches and like the lengths to which they
the fake posters on the wall.
The fake posters
about
and
lice.
Yeah, and then talking about the lamps inside the gas trucks. Yeah. It was such a psychological just of having them in there and why they needed them in there. And it's that stuff is just wild. Like
it's so horrible. Like,
I didn't know the extent of all that.
The deception. And that's what I think the whole second era part 1, that whole segment is all about deception. And how I think it was what Rudolph said. He said like the whole machinery depended on people not knowing, because if people knew, it wouldn't be efficient. It would take a long time to clean up like all that stuff. And just the extent they went to, and people
the barbers.
Let's talk about the barbers. So Bomba, he tells that horrible story about how his friend's wife came in and how his friend had to decide whether or not to tell his wife that she was about to die. And that was just...
And he told her. He told her.
Yeah.
She started warning other people.
Yeah.
The Nazis got wind of it. They took her and they tortured her.
Yeah.
And then she pointed out the person that told her, and they threw him in one of the ovens alive.
That was awful. But then you have that whole story about the Czech families. And that was so hard. Like that was the moment where I like balled my fist and I was just like, why? Because why did they do that? Why did they keep them alive? Why did they build a school? I was so confused and angry at that. Yeah. And the whole story that Rudolph tells about the leader, how he commits suicide. Like I was on the edge of my seat. I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Like, does the leader, did they do a resistance? Cause I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And then it just ends in the leader's suicide and like they all go to the chamber. Yep. And then of course, Philip talks about when they start singing the national anthem and how he went into the gas chamber with them. Yeah. And they're like, no, someone has to tell our story. Like, get out. That was, yeah. God, I just can't. I can't fathom living through something like this, you know. I can't either. I can only imagine the compartmentalizing that you have to do in your brain to shut off just certain parts of your memory. And can you ever truly shut it off? I probably not. Well, and I think too in a century where we didn't really value therapy and psychology, you know, like how many of these people were just kind of thrust back into the world and like, okay, go, you know, live your lives. And it's like, who didn't get the psychological help that they needed to ease them back into life. Right. And my hat goes off to Lanzmann, who pushed these people to talk. Like, and I felt really conflicted at first. I'm like, wow, he's really kind of being pushy, especially with Mordecai. Remember, like, he's like, oh, but are you really alive? I think it's in the first part. Right. And I was like, oh shit, like he's really asking him that? Like he really, really did push them. Abraham at one point doesn't want to go on talking. He says like, please, you have to, Abraham. And it's like, I know that if I was in that position, I would immediately just be like, it's okay, we don't have to talk about it. Mm-hmm. Like it's just the gall that Lanzmann had and his mission and the way that he was like so steadfast in it. I was in awe of. Well, I think too, he came off
great to me in terms of like he was pushing people, but it's for this higher purpose.
Of course.
And
That's
I
what
think
mean.
he was always respectful about it.
Yeah, I think so too.
And you can tell that everyone he interviewed outside of the Germans had respect for him and liked him, you know, like no one kind of seemed to really be annoyed with him outside of the Germans.
No,
but like
they didn't.
The fact, let's talk about the barber scene, the hair cutting scene where Abraham is cutting his friend's hair and he recounts this entire thing. And he does need to take a second. Like a lot of people, like a lot of the witnesses in the film, they need a second. And you could call it exploitative of like the camera lingering on them as they're like clearly upset. I don't think so. I mean, I think it's all part of like
the mission, I think.
Well, you know, I think it's all part of like capturing who these people are and what this has done to them.
Yeah.
And
Philip at one point says, please stop.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. But then I think Philip is grateful for that he didn't stop and I think Abraham too, like they have their moment and then they come back. They don't stop. They actually keep going.
Yeah.
If they were really, really, if they couldn't, they wouldn't, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like literally Lanzmann asking Mordecai, like, what did you do when you uncovered the body of your wife and your daughter? And he was like, what do you mean? I cried. But it's the way that he went there. Like Lanzmann went there. I don't know. I think it's commendable and incredible. Even the bartender starts eyeing him. He doesn't let up. He doesn't even say anything about like who he is, what he's doing.
Yeah.
Like, I'm making a film, like nothing. Like he just has this guy dogging him and he's no fucks given.
Did you catch that moment where one of the Nazis he's interviewing, I forget which one it is, calls him Dr. Sorrel?
Yeah, he used a fake name.
Yeah, okay.
He said he was a historian.
But other Germans call him
Lanzmann.
Mr. Yeah, Lanzmann. So.
Yeah. I do like the moment though where he gets frustrated. Like
with the last guy.
With the SS guy. He gets frustrated with the last guy, but he also gets frustrated at the secret SS guy. Because he's asking him like, the SS guy comes out and says like, oh, the women were never beaten. And Claude Lanzmann was just like, why not? Like they were about to be thrown into the gas chamber. Why not? And he's like, don't be sore with me. Did you catch that?
Yeah.
That moment was,
Yeah.
He gets sore with the ghetto guy as well, because he's like, what you're saying is not, and it's true, what you're saying is not making sense. Like, and the ghetto guy's response or his justification was like, it blew my mind. It was just like, oh, the ghetto wasn't meant for that many people. Mm-hmm. That was his justification of why conditions were so bad.
You know what blew my mind too is in the scene with that last German, the ghetto guy, and he's like, what did you do after the war? And he's like, oh, I started writing books about mountaineering and stuff. And he's like, yeah, the mountains are beautiful, the air, it's fresh, unlike in
he said
Warsaw.
That. But the German guy said that.
Yeah, the German guy.
Yeah.
Like that was like, and I think it's the last thing you hear from him. And it felt like especially diabolical from someone who came off relatively unassuming and who kept claiming like, oh, no. Like I was just a small cog. I didn't know any of this was happening. I went to the ghetto like once.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
It is pretty wild.
There's something just so fascinating about, there's a great Night Gallery episode where it's about a Nazi hiding after the war in like South America. There's something and then there's the film Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier, where he again plays this. There's just something about like the psychology of the Nazis after the war and like what happened to them, because they're going through their own thing of like, I mean, it's just incredibly complex in terms of what they could be thinking or feeling, knowing that they're the great enemies of the 20th century. And how do you pick up normal life after that? And not that they should, but it's like to hear this guy was just like, because he was that last guy, he was like a law student.
Yeah.
But he instead, I don't think was able to practice and spent his time writing like mountaineering books. I just thought that was interesting.
So I think like, I mean, it's interesting. And the fact that he said about like the ghetto but why did you see that as like particularly menacing by this man? Because I think that in his like mind, he was like, I'm traumatized. I'm going to become a mountaineer, even though he was the one that was.
He was a Nazi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was particularly diabolical because he like kind of smiles as he says it, and he offers it up too. He's like, yeah, the mountains are clean and
Yeah,
the
not
fresh
like
air,
Warsaw.
unlike the ghetto.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa. And he kind of smiles when he says it too.
Yeah,
Like that seems especially evil.
it does. What was especially evil was the SS guy. So it was really interesting because the first part opened with a song, and it was Simon's song. And then part 2 opened with the SS singing that song that they made the Jews sing.
Right.
And him singing that song was like, to me, that was like the most evil.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It was.
Absolutely. I mean, this movie is so comprehensive because you get so many different people's takes. I love when they're talking to the train guy.
I know.
And then they talk to the historian and they're literally going through like the train logs.
Yeah.
And you see the documents and he's like, this means this means this, had this many passengers that left at this date, at this time. It got to this station then. Like, this is so thoroughly researched.
I know.
That it's just mind blowing.
And that moment is so great when he is with the historian, because he's like, I even wrote it down. Lanzmann himself, he was like, I love how they talk about how the document itself is fascinating. Did you catch that? Because Lanzmann was like holding it and he's like, why is this so fascinating? He's like, because
it's a physical piece of history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I loved that historian.
I loved the historian too. I did a little research on him too. He was he's Austrian, but his parents fled. He was born in Austria because he sounded exactly like Christoph Waltz. I'm like, this guy has to be Austrian. He was from Austria, but they fled like, I think in like 39.
Wow.
Like his parents like knew and they fled to New York.
Wow.
And then he joined the army in World War II. He fought in World War II because I think he was like 18 in 43 or something. So he was actually able to enlist in the U.S. Army. You know what was a moment? In Corfu, I think his name was Moish Mordo. He had like that weird cart.
The pig.
The pig.
The pigs that turned into Hitler.
And then you pan up to his face. And he's smiling.
Because his entire family was killed.
That was a moment.
And so, he has this folded piece of paper. It has like 4 different pigs on it. But when you fold it up a special way, the pigs make Hitler's face.
Yeah. And the whole Corfu thing is so heartbreaking. I mean, it's all heartbreaking, but yeah, I actually didn't know that the Nazis took over Corfu. I had no idea.
Yeah, same. I think, remember he interviews this woman that was a school teacher, or she was the wife of a Nazi. Yeah. Not in Corfu. I forget where that one was, but just, the breadth of people that he gets for this. He gets like everyone you would kind of imagine from all these different points of view. People who are right in the middle of it, people who are just on the fringes who only saw and heard like, a little bit. It's just, it's so thoroughly comprehensive.
Yeah. Because I have like all my things about, I'm just looking at my page about Second Era Part 1, which is about like basically the way that the Jews were deceived. One thing that really broke me was that the fucking vans had Red Cross on them.
Yeah, another
like, that's
deception.
Disgusting.
Yeah.
That's like so evil. That is like pure evil. I mean, the whole thing is pure evil, but there were moments like that, like when I heard about that, where I was just like, I mean, I like, you think you know how evil they are, and then they're just more evil.
Yeah.
The numbered hooks in the undressing room so you can remember where you put your jacket. Like that's...
Yeah.
And then there's that diorama.
Let's talk about... Yeah, I was going to bring up the diorama.
So the whole Auschwitz... Yeah, so...
It's one of the only times in the movie you do get some sort of visual representation of what went down.
Yes.
And all of the people that they crammed into the chambers.
But it's the way it's shot. Of course, he's moving it like... And it feels like this huge thing, but it's a diorama. It's crazy. I mean, would you ever, this is like such a weird question, but like, like you can visit Auschwitz.
Yeah, no, I think I would want to in my lifetime.
I don't know. The shot on the train tracks moving slowly towards the gate, like that shot made me sick.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I could go.
Yeah, it looks sinister. Like you can just tell that even without the history, like you can tell it's a terrible place. Yeah, I think I'd want to go sometime in my life. I think for the same reason that everyone should see this film once in their lives.
That's true. That's true.
And I haven't been to the 9/11 museum. I'd like to go there. You know, I think that stuff is hard, but
I've been to the Museum of Tolerance.
Oh, here in LA.
Here in LA, yeah. And it's incredible. They took us in. They took us on like a senior trip in 12th grade. And I still remember, like, I remember every single detail. And it was like almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, this is. I think the notion. How do you feel about this being, you know, when it was originally released, being shown in one day?
I don't know if I'd be able to do it.
Because it's like your entire waking hours. I think especially with an intermission in the middle, this is like an 11-hour thing. And
I don't know if I'd be able to do it.
Yeah. I think I think it works like if you get the Criterion disc and you split it up into the 4 episodes, which are still 2 to 2.5 hours long each.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to do it because, and again, if this was made today, it would be this like, you know, docu-series or something on HBO or something. Yeah.
There's something commendable about, I think,
making it theatrical.
And like, it just keeps going, and you can't get out. Like, I think there is something commendable to that. But I just like personally know my own psychology and my own sensitivity, and I don't know if I could.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I really don't.
Because we usually on this show we try to watch films the way they were like originally seen. So if a film was just like one film, we try to do it all at once. But yeah, I can't imagine doing that either. It's just so completely overwhelming, and it's a lot. But no, I agree with what you said, and I like that. If the film does just keep going forward, like, not that it holds you hostage, but it's like, no, you're gonna stay in this, and you're gonna get more, and you're gonna get more, and you're gonna get it from this angle, and you're gonna hear about the trains, and you're gonna hear about this, and it's just like, in its determination to be like so comprehensive, it needs to be this long. I really do. I don't think there's anything here that's superfluous. Like.
No, not at all.
It feels like a proper length. Like I can't imagine this being much shorter.
Yeah.
Because again, you get the time to settle in with people. I think
don't either.
So many other documentaries, you just you'll get little snippets of people. But the fact that you really I feel like I got a good handle on most of the people that were interviewed.
Like Abraham, like I knew immediately when I heard his voice, I was like, this is Abe. Yeah. Like we know Hawaiian him shirt. Now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same with Philip. Like I said, like I grew so used to his voice, and it was a weird, like, I don't want to say comfort, but like when I heard his voice come up, I was like, I know exactly this is Philip. I know what he went through.
Yeah.
I know what he's talking about.
I know exactly what you mean.
Definitely. There was something really interesting going back to kind of our like thinking about the Holocaust movies we've seen. Jan, the Polish underground guy, says something really interesting. When he went into the ghetto and he was so distraught and so shocked, he said, like, this was not the world. I've never read about it. I never saw theater or a movie. He says that.
Well, he says it before a lot of the big movies came out.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
So I just thought that was like so fascinating. It's like now us watching this, like, this is our world. We know about it. We have seen theater. We have seen movies. And so just the thought of that is like going in blind, completely blind. I just thought that was a really powerful way for him to put it.
Like going in blind to
the ghetto and just like what was happening.
Yes.
Like the fact that he said like, this was not the world. Like I had no idea.
Yeah.
And of course we get that from a lot of people, but there was something about, of course, I'm going to like gravitate towards like someone who says something about like, I'd never seen theater. I'd never seen movies.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Which I thought was very incredible.
Yeah. There was something, I know you touched on it earlier, but that Warsaw ghetto, again, it's right in the middle of Warsaw, right? And there's this whole metropolis happening outside. And one of the guys at the end who talks about escaping and just seeing the city, like you said earlier, and just like life was continuing.
He said there was a cinema. He said like people were going and
Yeah, it's how many people didn't know the extent of the horrors that were happening in their own backyard.
Yeah.
Actually, I know too in the U.S. Again, I'm not a historian. I'm not like a super knowledgeable person about history, but I know in the U.S. The general thing was we didn't know the extent of the horrors of the Holocaust until a little bit later.
And that was the mission of the Polish underground worker,
Right.
was to tell people.
Yeah, exactly.
But
It's just
he was
wild.
so affected. Like, he couldn't, from the start, he's like, I can't do this. Like, I don't go back there.
Yeah.
And that was just the ghetto. I mean, I don't want to like diminish, the ghetto was horrible.
But the camps were.
But I thought like maybe they took him to the camps too to see. But no, it was just, he was that affected by the ghetto. And
yeah, the trains, the camps. It's just horrific. It's absolutely horrific. I still just can't believe that this happened in the 20th century. And I think too, the way that so many Jews didn't know what was happening. Like they were like, okay, you're going to be relocated. And also just the name Final Solution. Like, dear God, that is like so insidious. The Final Solution. It's just, it's wild. It's so wild. I think, growing up, I mean, when are you first taught about the Holocaust? Like maybe like 6th or 7th grade or something like that. 5th grade? I don't know exactly when, but so, I've known about it for a long time, but I think I still just can't wrap my head around that it happened. Like,
yeah.
And the details of watching this film, of these firsthand accounts, like I just can't, I just don't know how did this happen? Why did it happen? It's
I know you didn't want to do sight and sound, but I have like, there was a moment where I was really, and I do think that he is working with sight and sound so well. So there is a sound I want to mention.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shot. It's one of those, and I guess it's tied. It's sight and sound in one. It's, I forget who he's talking to, but it's basically just like this beautiful pastoral shot of like the fields and the country. And he says, it's Lanzmann himself. He goes like, I suppose there were fine days like today. And then whoever he was talking to says, unfortunately, there were even finer.
Yes.
And that like really, that was like, I keep saying like, that was really a gut punch. That was really a gut punch. But really, this whole movie is like that. It's full of moments like that. But that in particular, I was like, that's some like sad poetry. Yeah. Some tragic poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the fact that this was shot over 6 years really allowed it to evolve organically, because you don't feel like Lanzmann is fishing.
No.
And trying to create these moments. Like these moments just happened in the 6 years of interviewing people.
Yeah.
And I can also only imagine what this would do to you for, he spent 6 years filming it, 5 years editing. So for a decade, his life was just this. And then beyond this, because he used the unused footage to make a bunch of other movies.
Yeah.
So it's like for decades, his life.
This has been his life. Well, Raul Hilberg, who's the historian, this was his entire life. And he wanted to be like a chemist. Of course, he's going to school in like the 40s. He originally wanted to be a chemist, but then no, he wrote like 1,000-page, it's like the definitive book about the Holocaust. And he actually didn't like the word Holocaust. His book was called, God, I wish I wrote it down. I think it's called like The Annihilation of Jews in Europe. And it's 1,000 and something pages. And like this was his whole life. And that I can't imagine. Like that's, are you looking it up?
Oh, he has a lot of books.
He's very famous.
Wow. I was going to like find the one, but there's a lot.
What's his main one? It's like a manifesto.
Is it The Destruction of the European Jews?
That's it. That's the one.
Okay.
But this was his whole life. And it's the way he talks. He's such a good speaker too. Yeah, and his face. I mean, you can just read.
They don't make people like him anymore.
From this man's face, yeah, just like, this is my life, is talking about this atrocity. And you can see it on his face.
Yeah.
It's the amount that Lanzmann, like how many, did I write it down? Did I mention how many countries he goes to? Oh, taking place in 14 countries. Like he went to 14 countries.
Yeah, that's wild.
how did he take the equipment? It has like 5 cinematographers. I can only imagine like that's why. But
what did you think about, because this is something I saw mentioned a couple places, what did you think about, especially in the first era, mostly the first episode of the first era, especially when they're not speaking German or French or whatever, and he is a translator, and so you see someone speak, but you don't get subtitles, and then when the French woman relays it to him, then you get it. But I know some people were turned off by that initially because it's a lot of like...
It was a little bit of recalibrating my like ears and eyes, but...
I get why he did it. I mean, obviously, if you don't speak the language, he doesn't speak Polish or whatever, but it's like, it creates a little bit more of a... I think what it does, too, is this movie doesn't feel edited.
No.
Like there's no cleaning up of like pauses or anything. And I think kind of letting those scenes play out of like hearing the woman translate for him it made it feel that much more authentic.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And just the fact that usually when he starts interviewing someone, there's like a good 5 to 10 seconds of just the person's face. Like he doesn't cut that.
Yeah.
Which is so important, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, this is about as definitive as it gets in terms of films.
Yeah, what did you think about it's in part 2 of the first era. He really spends that time in the town talking to people who live in homes that once belonged to Jews. And he's in it for a second and he's like, that's a nice door.
Oh, yeah.
Where did the door come from? And it's like, he knows.
Yeah.
He knows what the answer is.
Just see the different responses too.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, I miss them. Oh no, I don't
Some
miss them.
person said they were dishonest. They exploited.
Yeah.
Of course, that one idiot who only missed the women.
The Jewesses.
But the women too were like, we missed the women. They were or they said I think, did they make like a horrible, am I imagining this? Did they make a horrible joke about like, we're glad the women are gone?
Yeah, because they were
so
competition.
Yeah.
They did say that.
It's awful.
That's weird. Yeah, because those villages, like you get they're so nonchalant about it. Yeah. And I get that we're like 30 plus years removed from it at this point, but yeah, they just like, yeah. I know that's the criticism the film got was, from
Poland.
Yeah.
Did you notice that it was only in Corfu where they had tattoos?
Yes, I did notice
But I think it was because those people were like admitted into the concentration camps because they didn't tattoo people if they exterminated them. Like it was just people who like actually were.
Well, I wonder too. You don't see the arms of some people like Bamba or.
So I'm sure all
Philip.
of those guys had it.
They
but
probably had it, I would guess.
It was interesting that it was like, now we're in Corfu. We're in this beautiful place. And the first thing we see is tattoos.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was like such a move.
Yeah. What did you think about them doing the ghettos at the end, kind of finishing with the ghettos?
That was interesting because you'd think that would be the first part.
Yeah.
I don't know. But it was very symbolic where it was the one guy who literally said, like, I felt like I was the last Jew. And then the movie ends.
Yep.
Like that was.
The final image is a train.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the structure of the documentary, it all works. And I can see why they were editing this for 5 years because it has this not cyclical nature, but like, well, kind of like there's no grand introduction, right? The movie already assumes you know about the war and the Holocaust, the basics, right? But the film does this thing where it'll bring, stuff keeps getting brought back up later and later. And I think by doing that, instead of going in this totally like chronological order, like starting with the ghettos, I think the film just like reaffirms everything more. Yeah. That's how I felt, at least, of like.
It's very thematic. Like I very quickly picked up like, okay, now we're talking about vans and now we're talking about arriving at the camp. Now we're talking about deception. Like that was very easy to pick up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is structured. It's not just like.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And like with the whole getting the testimonies of like, we talked about a little bit, the people in the town, some were better than others. There was the awful guy who was like imitating. He's like, oh, yeah, like they were speaking Jew and he's like imitating them.
Oh yeah.
That guy sucked. But then there was also that one guy who was like breaking down. He's like, you can't forget something like that. And Lanzmann even like pats him on the shoulder. He's like, it's okay. Like that was so, I don't know. I can't speak much about that, but I did think that there was plenty of people who were saying, like, of course it was atrocious. We had to see it all. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think the work done here by Claude Lanzmann and his team is just staggering and such a gift to the world, to humanity, of this lasting document. As horrible as these details are, it's important that we remember that this happened, and we remember how it happened, and where it happened. And I think all of this is so important. And he basically dedicated his career to this project, because again, this spawned a bunch of other films that used footage from this unused footage. I mean, this is again just essential viewing for. I wish I had seen this at an earlier age, because this, I guess we didn't say in the beginning, it's both of our first time seeing this. I think I got it in a Criterion sale like close to a decade ago. Wow. And it just sat on my shelf because I knew, it was something that I had to do, but I was like just hesitant, especially because of the runtime. And I'm just really glad I sat down with it. And, I can't wait to show this to my kids, No, it's important.
It is.
I mean, again, you learn about. I remember the big push for us was in 9th grade. Was a big Holocaust. Like, I made a Holocaust in quotes documentary when I was in 9th grade, because I was it was a mix of like English class and studio, and we were supposed to make like a video project. And so I just like took a bunch of archival photos, so exactly what this movie doesn't do, and just put them in a video. But like, I think it's important for kids of a certain age to learn. And I think I can see why maybe this film is shown in some schools, but I could see being in 9th grade and having to sit through like a 9.5 hour movie where it's like mostly talking heads and stuff. Like, I could see how this would, although again, it's not about the entertainment value, but kids would disengage with it. I think most kids.
Yeah. I don't think I would. I think I would want my kids to be mature enough to like sit and grasp.
Appreciate it and not just like suffer through it because it's long and slow, in quotes, whatever. Yeah, this is essential. This is about as essential as it gets. I think the highest rated, in quotes, documentary on the Sight and Sound list is Man with a Movie Camera, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Which is insane to me.
That's not really a doc.
Yeah.
That's like a essay.
Yeah, okay, that's true. Again, I'm not trying to put everything in boxes, but
are you sure?
I would say, I mean, can you even think of a documentary that's more essential than this one?
No. And I don't want, as I said in the beginning, like, I don't really watch documentaries that much.
I kind of agree with you.
Takes the cake for me. I think this is the most incredible documentary I've ever seen.
Well, I think you're right, and I think we live in an age of disposable documentaries, like the Netflix docuseries or HBO docuseries. Where things are like stretched out longer than they need to be.
Yeah,
like I remember us watching the Nexium documentary, which I think HBO just did a sequel to, or was it on Netflix? I don't remember, but like it was just too long. I'm like, this doesn't need to be 8 episodes. It's about one cult. Anyway, my tangent is that I think often documentaries are disposable. Mm-hmm. Like, you could just as easily read it in a book or like, and I think what sets Shoah apart, again, this isn't the greatest documentary I've ever seen because of the subject matter, which, yes, is very important and very heavy and all of that stuff. But like, it's the best doc I've ever seen because of its treatment of the subject matter.
Yeah. And because there's no archival footage.
Yes. And I think just as a piece of cinema, it's so interesting because it is such a great, grand piece of cinema while also being this really great piece of just history of social document, historical document. So, yeah, it works in every way, like from an educational point, from a film point. And I was just so completely bowled over by this.
So was I.
Well, that leads us to Pauline Kael, because on this show, we typically read Pauline Kael's review of the film.
In doing my research,
you know a little bit.
I know a little bit.
So famously, Pauline Kael did not really like this movie.
Which is crazy. Because her parents
were Jewish immigrants from Poland.
Well, let's hear what she had to say then.
She says, I ask the forbearance of readers for a dissenting view of a film that is widely regarded as a masterpiece. I found Shoah loggy and exhausting right from the start, and when it had been going on for an hour or longer, I was squirming relentlessly, my attention slackening. Sitting in a theater seat for a film as full of dead spaces as this one seems to me a form of self-punishment. Lanzmann has taken the Holocaust as his artwork, and he aestheticizes everything for us. When you come out, you're likely to feel dazed and confirmed in all your worst fears. Implicitly, the film says that the past and the present are one, that this horror could happen again. See, the Polish peasants are still talking about how the Jews killed Christ and hoarded gold. They saw the smoke from the ovens, the death centers were in fields adjoining their farms, and they think the Jews deserve to burn. The way the evidence is presented in this movie, you can't keep from passing judgment, and it's almost always facile judgment against the Gentiles, even those who were powerless. And then about Lanzmann, she said this, the heart of his obsession appears to be to show you that the Gentiles will do it to the Jews again if they get a chance. Lanzmann did all the questioning himself while putting pressure on people in a discursive manner, which gave the film a deadening weight. Shoah is a long moan. It's saying, we've always been oppressed and will be oppressed again. So interestingly, because she wrote for The New Yorker, in 2010, the critic Richard Brody is quoted as saying that Cale's misunderstandings of Shoah are so grotesque as to seem willful. And then he went on to say this is the problem with her criticism overall, is it's personal for her, and she would have written a great autobiography. If she had written an autobiography, it would have been one of the great literary works of her time.
What do you mean? She believes if she wrote an autobiography?
No, he believes. Richard Brody. But because again, Pauline was known for, people asked her about her life. She's like, just read my film reviews. Like, my life is in there. So obviously,
So it seems like, but maybe she has a problem with it being, do you agree with her?
No,
that it's like,
no, not
that
at all.
What his main intention was to show that this could happen again? I don't think that's the case.
No. And again, he does show that racism is still alive and stuff like that.
But that's
no, I don't.
not the focus.
No, that's not the focus at all. I disagree. And she seems to think, again, that he gets in the way of the film. She says, in quotes, Lanzmann has taken the Holocaust as his artwork and he aestheticizes everything for us. I don't understand what she's saying at all. Like, I couldn't disagree more. And I think
it is artwork, but I don't think that
his artwork though,
I
think it's so, he's so
I don't think
cognizant of,
I think he's just go ahead.
Yeah, no, of just like, his style is not getting in the way of the film. Like, he's so cognizant of staying out of the way of the film and letting the people tell their story, even though he is heavily in the film interviewing people, because again, it's a personal project, but it never feels like, a vanity project or something. So yeah, I heavily disagree with Pauline here. In fact, I think this might be the worst take I've ever seen her give.
Could be. Yeah. But the things that she's saying is wrong with it don't seem like reasons to give it a bad review. Like the fact that she it's one long moan. It is. Like, I was moaning and crying and sad. Like, that's not a reason to give it a bad review.
Yeah.
Even her saying I was in a theater with all this empty space. Like, what did she say? She said
the empty space of the film.
Why is that?
She says dead space, which I feel like the wording is not great on her end.
I don't get why that's bad.
I don't know.
But then you have to take into the fact that...
Yeah, she said, sitting in a theater seat for a film as full of dead spaces as this one seems to me a form of self-punishment. Just talking about the long pauses and... But again...
That's not...
This story can't be told quickly.
We're not going in there for fun, Pauline.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like she's kind of missing the whole, yes, it is all these things.
Yeah.
I don't want to call it punishment because I was thoroughly engaged. I wasn't just checking my phone but it is a form of, you are going to affect your mental health while watching this. That doesn't mean you shouldn't watch it. That doesn't mean it's bad.
Yeah.
So I'm
No, I think this is the worst thing I've ever read of hers.
It's interesting, though, that her parents are Polish immigrants. Like, that's really fascinating.
Well, I think, too, it goes into her last line. Like, it's a long moan. It's saying we've always been oppressed and will be oppressed again. And I don't think the movie is that full of despair in terms of like it's going to happen again. I don't think the film is saying that. I think maybe that's her own read into it because of her background.
Maybe.
But yeah. Well, that was Shoah.
Yeah. You know, do you know about the Shoah Foundation?
I do.
And that's run by Spielberg.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought of that right now.
I still do think it's interesting the way that I don't know if he made Schindler's List as a way like he felt bad about making the Nazis like the cartoonish villains in the Indiana Jones movies. And he's like, I need to properly tackle this, or if those things happen naturally. I mean, I don't think him using them as, to get to your point earlier about not being able to watch films now, or you don't know if you will be able to. Everything is of its time, I think. And talking about Inglourious Bastards, I want to touch on that really quick. Is I think it's a great film. I think it's a great piece of filmmaking, and I think it, like everything Tarantino does, it's like a little infantile. It's a little juvenile. It's a lot juvenile, right? But it's this revenge fantasy. There's this catharsis to it.
Definitely. I think it's my favorite Tarantino movie.
It's probably number 2 for me behind Hollywood. But I think in the way that Christoph Waltz, I think he is terrifying in that film. But also, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Inglourious Bastards, I can't believe we're even mentioning that movie in this episode, but the end, he is so ridiculous, right? Like he's terrifying, and then Tarantino completely takes the wind out of his sails as a Nazi of like, oh, he's going to very quickly flip sides,
right?
And he's a little bitch when they're like carving into him at the end. So like, he
does survive.
He survives.
Which isn't, but I think that's the right move. Because yes, he's making this revenge fantasy, but I think him surviving is Tarantino's way of asserting, like, I know this didn't happen. Like,
right.
I know that Hitler wasn't killed in a theater, and I know that it wasn't a happy ending. Like,
yeah.
No, I think I will be. I'm just like, right now, I can't imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I need a good while, I think.
Well, no, I think you're onto something though about the way that the media portrays the Nazis. And I do think in this day and age, because of all the things we just mentioned, everyone knows they're bad, but I think some of the true sinister nature of the Nazis has been diminished a little bit. And I think watching something like Shoah, where you really hear firsthand about all these atrocities, like it's a sobering reminder that they're not just the cartoon villain.
Yeah. It really...
It's interesting because it's so easy to make them the villain, right? Because everyone knows that they're terrible. So I think almost as like as a narrative device, and there's so many films and shows in which they are the villain, or books, whatever, because it's plugged in. People immediately know.
They're like the universal villain, really.
They're the universal villain. Anyway, this was Shoah.
Yeah.
Essential. If you listen to this episode and haven't seen the film, seriously consider giving it a watch. I think
thought about that because I don't think a lot of people have seen this.
Oh,
our listener numbers for this one might be quite low.
I don't know about that. I mean, it is one of the premier documentaries.
But all my friends I was talking to, they're like, I just haven't done it. I haven't pulled the trigger. So I don't know.
Well, it's times like this I'm glad we have a podcast because
I'm so glad.
it was sitting on my shelf for years. So the fact that the show pushed me to
I know.
Watch
yeah,
it.
one of my because I told my best friend like what I was doing. She's like, why? And I was like, it's on the list. That was it. And I was like,
yeah. Well, next week we're doing a s'mores episode. It's the films of Maya Deren. We were going to do it last month for our s'mores episode, but Kenneth Anger passed away, and so we ended up doing him instead. So this month we're doing the films of Maya Deren. So we'll be covering a handful of her short films. Mm-hmm. So come back next week for that. Again, a special shout out to our patrons at the Pauline Kael tier, John Pennington and Cynthia Fordwell. Thank you guys so much for being patrons. We could not do the show without you. Until then, I'm Greg.
I'm Jackie.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Seen and Heard is an official podcast of the Arroyo Film Club, featuring Greg Kleinschmidt and Jacqueline Postagian. Theme music by Andrew Cox. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. If you have any questions, comments, or you just want to say hi, email us hello@seenandheardpod.com or visit our website, www.seenandheardpod.com.